Thank you so much, Pat. Thank you, Mike. Thanks to Isabelina, who I'm sorry can't be with us. And thank you to all of you for the work that you do. It's so nice to see familiar faces today and see some lots of new faces. And I'm very honored to be able to talk to you about something that is very, very important to me, professionally and personally. As Pat mentioned, at the tender age of 22, I went to the University of Connecticut to get my master's degree. At the time, I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to teach, but I didn't know exactly what. I thought it would probably be in the area of reading. I didn't know that I would meet Isabel Liberman, who really was probably one of the most influential people in my life in terms of mentoring me and giving me a path. I also didn't know at the time that I had some people in my life that had, significant learning challenges. I knew, but I didn't really know what it was. I didn't understand it fully. One of those people being my brother. You'll see a picture of him in a minute. I'm one of 6 children. My mother told me I was born to be a teacher. I was the 5th of 6 children, and my little sister cried when I went to school, to kindergarten, because she wanted to come with me. So every day I'd come home and we'd play school. And she went to kindergarten 2 years later reading. And obviously didn't have reading disabilities because she wouldn't have learned to read, just by exposure. But, we played school every day. It was just a passion of mine. And fast forward, I married a wonderful man, Chip, who's pictured at the top here. And he didn't know he was dyslexic until I diagnosed him 2 years into the marriage. I said, oh my gosh, this is really crazy. I didn't really know my brother Jim was dyslexic, like I said, but I knew he struggled with learning, and I learned why as I understood more about dyslexia and reading disabilities. And then we had 3 children, and they all have had learning challenges, but Kara, pictured here, is the one who struggled the most. And it took her, 12 years and 7 colleges to graduate from college. She did that 2 years ago at the age of 32. She's getting married next Saturday, which is awesome. So, this is a personal journey as well as a professional journey for me. And I've just learned so much from all of you, from the people I've worked with. This slide basically is important because what I want to say here is there are many faces of dyslexia. I've taught children with dyslexia, students with different types of reading disabilities for 20 years before I embarked on teacher training, and I picture those faces all the time. I picture those faces, and they're all different, and their scenarios are all different. Dyslexia is very complicated, right? There is no classic dyslexic, and I'll talk more about that. These 3 people pictured here couldn't be more different on so many levels. What their gifts are, what their challenges are, what their co-occurring, otherwise referred to as comorbidity is, because very rarely do you have a child with dyslexia who's just dyslexic. They often have other issues, which I'll allude to also. So the differences are personal, as I say here. The identification must be informed by scientific and educational research. We know so much now that we didn't know when I got into the field many years ago. But the treatment is educational, right? So we have to have the very best teachers working with our students with disabilities, today specifically talking about students with dyslexia. And the understanding is scientific, and that is something that's driven home every day to me when I look at the research, particularly the brain research. Our technology is allowing us to look inside the brain, which is phenomenal. It's still, in so many ways, as Ken Pugh, the Director of Research and President Haskins Labs, says, we're still in the infancy stage of the brain research, but we still know so much more about dyslexia and other learning challenges because of that brain research. And what we know from research is incredibly substantive. Thousands of studies have asked and answered these questions. How does a good reader read? how do they learn to read, why do some students have difficulty learning to read. This is a really important question. What's the relationship between spoken language and reading? Because we know that language is at the core, and we have to understand what that role is. And most importantly, how can we help the students that struggle? I don't think I've ever spoken to a group, or very rarely have I spoken to a group, whether it's 2 or 20, or in this case, I don't know how many people are here today, without showing Hollis Scarborough's grade, because I think it really depicts the complexity of reading so beautifully. And, you know, you look at the skilled reader where everything is working beautifully. The strands are tightly woven, they're tightly bound, they're working seamlessly, seemingly, to fluently execute and coordinate this word reading along with language comprehension. But when something goes awry, which it does for our children with learning disabilities and reading disabilities, we have to unravel the rope and figure out, well, where are the frayed strands here? And so when you see this, you can sort of get that picture. I always talk about the simple view of reading here, and I'm going to keep coming back to this. The simple view of reading is D, decoding, aka word recognition, times LC, language comprehension, equals RC, reading comprehension. And it's the product of the two. If you have phenomenal decoding skills, but your language comprehension is poor, your reading comprehension is going to be poor. Conversely, if you have poor decoding skills, which is the case for the student with dyslexia in general, but great language comprehension, your RC, or reading comprehension, is going to be poor. So they're equally important. They're very, very different, but they certainly are very highly correlated, and we have to keep thinking about that. If you take that simple view and you think about 4 quadrants or 4 scenarios, and again, this is somewhat of a simplification, but if you look at it in terms of students that have poor word reading versus good word reading, students who have poor comprehension versus good comprehension, phonological skills versus non-phonological skills, we can see these 4 groupings, right? The skilled readers have good word reading and good language comprehension. The children who have good word reading but poor language comprehension, we call those students with specific comprehension deficit, other titles, other names, whatever. We'll talk a little bit more about those students. The garden variety poor word reading, garden variety poor readers, which is a research term, not my favorite, but that's what they're called, garden variety. Mixed reading disability is another term for those folks, and I'll speak a little bit about those children who have both poor word reading and poor language comprehension. But today we're going to focus on the lower left quadrant, those students who are dyslexic. The research calls them RD, reading disabled. So their 2 are very much the same, but in the research field, oftentimes you'll see them referred to as RD. Those are students that have the phonological processing difficulties, which I'll talk more about. Dyslexia, as most of you know, was addressed in the LD guidelines. I and Pat and many others probably in this room worked on those LD guidelines in 2010. Louise Spear-Swirling was also part of that group, and a very well-respected, great colleague and friend, which you'll see reference to. In those guidelines, we specified these three profiles. The students that had specific word decoding difficulties, the students had specific reading comprehension difficulties, and those students who had both. Okay, so this goes back to 2010, not new. But certainly we're revisiting and refocusing what the implications are for that. In 2015, again, I and a number of people in this room, with Pat and Steve Prophet and other wonderful people, worked as part of a working group to talk about dyslexia, dyslexia and SLD, and to really come up with some important documents that would inform the work that all of you do. One of which was to have a working definition of dyslexia. And we looked at lots of definitions. We had lots of people who had opinions, right, Pat? And we tried to build consensus in this process where we met over the course of, I think it was almost a year. And we came up with these essential components, which most of you are aware of, but excuse me, just to reiterate some of them. Specific learning disability, SLD, excuse me, neurobiological in origin. I would love some water if somebody could get me some of that to grab. Thank you. Neurobiological in origin, which means obviously you're born with this, right? This is neurobiological. We have great brain research that shows what it looks like in the brain, and doesn't mean that it's a death sentence by no means, but it does mean that it's something that you're wired with. It impacts reading, and it impacts reading for different students in different ways: decoding, accuracy, fluency, and most importantly, and almost always, 98 or 99% of the time, you'll see spelling is impacted. It's unexpected or inconsistent with students' other abilities. Thank you, Mike. Oh, perfect. Oh, that's helpful. Thank you. So it's unexpected, and I'll come back to this, but that's very important because so many of our students look, right, this is an invisible disability. They look great, they seem fine, they might have great interpersonal skills or not. They have oftentimes great language comprehension, and yet they get to school and they hit the wall. And school is not a great place for them often. And they start to have some emotional issues too. So they look good. They could be super, super smart. So it's inconsistent and unexpected, something very important. And then again, it persists despite the provision of appropriate instruction. And that's something that we have to keep thinking about. These children change through the lifespan. Their difficulties manifest in different ways. And of course, it makes sense because they're living life and they're in different circumstances, whatever those circumstances may be, good, bad, whatever, and that impacts their learning. So we have to keep revisiting how are they doing? How is it going? Is this working? Is it not working, etc. And the results from these significant, the dyslexia results from difficulties with phonological processing, i.e., a difficulty with the awareness and ability to manipulate the sound structure of English, of spoken language. And you'll see at the bottom this URL that takes you to a fact sheet, a frequently asked question sheet that we really try to construct to address some of these complexities that I'm alluding to here. Dyslexia is a subcategory of specific learning disability, and it was added to distinguish these students from other students with specific learning disability. Again, a very important point to make, because in the state of Connecticut, I grew up here, I went to graduate school here, but then I left for 18 years and I was all over the map. And when I came back 18 years later, I thought, oh, well, dyslexia will be certainly embraced, understood here, because after all, Isabel Liberman, Haskins Laboratories, right, all these people who I thought would have impacted the field would have, acknowledged that dyslexia in fact exists. And was I surprised to learn that that was not the case? And I saw it time and time again, whether I was advocating for a child at a PPT or I was working individually with a child and a family, dyslexia, the D word, did not come into the conversation. So it's wonderful that it's here now. It's so great that we are acknowledging that it in fact does exist and that we are identifying children with dyslexia and that we will get the right intervention and treatment for them. So let me just take a minute to describe these three different subgroups, and I'll spend the most time, obviously, on the students with word reading difficulties, i.e. the students with dyslexia. But I also want to acknowledge that there are these other groups of students who have reading disabilities, again, not dyslexia, but other types of reading disabilities. The specific word reading difficulty subgroup is also referred to as dyslexia, or students with dyslexia. It is the most common and best understood type of learning disability. And why is that? Because those students can and should be identified early, right? We can find these children. I can walk into a preschool classroom and pick them out. I basically can tell you which ones are going to have difficulty based on a number of things, and obviously the fact that I've been working with individuals with dyslexia for many years. And when I say identify, it's not, I say this to parents all the time, and educators, it's not to pin a label on the child. That's not the point. The point is to say, your child has dyslexia, or your child has symptoms or characteristics of dyslexia, and as such, we just want to keep a close eye on him or her. We want to make sure that we give him or her the very best instruction, and it's not about, like I said, labeling. It's about providing the right interventions and instruction. This subgroup's primary difficulty is with phonological, the phonological component of language that are, have usually impact word recognition, almost always, decoding, encoding, or spelling, and fluency is the big problem for many of these students. A lot of teachers will say to me, I can get the students to read the words accurately and to some extent automatically, but when they have to put it in text and read, passages, that's when we see the breakdown. So what do we do about that? And again, in most cases with the classic, which I said earlier doesn't necessarily exist, but the profile of the student with dyslexia, usually the other components of the language system are intact. So they have pretty good semantics and syntax and listening comprehension and oral vocabulary. The second group is the specific reading comprehension subgroup. These students have, remember the quadrant, right? They are the students in the upper right-hand quadrant, right? Those are the students that have decent word recognition because their phonological processing is intact, and they don't necessarily have a history of reading difficulties or decoding difficulties. But they do have difficulties with reading comprehension that are linked to oral language comprehension difficulties, or they might be linked to oral vocabulary difficulties. Again, the basis for this subgroup is on the language, is on the oral language development. And you'll notice, and then this next bullet is really important, because even though you would think, oh, they would qualify for speech and language services, you might give them and have them evaluated by an SLP, and it turns out that they're not eligible for speech and language services. Many of these students' difficulties emerge later. They're called LERDs, late emerging reading disabilities. Again, that's a term in the literature, and we don't know as much about these students from the research, but we do know we're learning more and more about this profile. And then the last subgroup are students that have both problems with word recognition, phonological difficulties, as well as poor reading comprehension. And these problems may be caused by decoding and language comprehension problems, oral comprehension, and or vocabulary. And difficulties emerge early, but persist even if decoding is addressed. And this group obviously is very challenging because you have to make you have to prioritize which issue is more important to address, right? We have to sometimes make hard decisions. And even though you might be inclined to try to do everything and use sort of a one-size-fits-all approach, meaning, we're going to use an intervention that addresses the whole panoply of reading, it's more important to be strategic and map out sequentially how to approach, which I'll talk more about when I talk about the interventions. Each profile of reading difficulties has different intervention needs. That's the whole point of this, right? One size does not fit all. And this is research from Aaron, as well as Louise Spear-Swirling here at Southern Connecticut. It's also true that each profile has different needs for progress monitoring. And we are so assessment focused today. And if there's one thing I hear just resoundingly from teachers and administrators, it's we don't have time to teach our students. We spend so much time assessing, we don't have time to teach, and I totally understand that. So we have to be strategic about what assessments we administer. Just because it says do all of them, does that mean we have to do all of them? If we're redundant, we have to get rid of some of those redundancies so we can spend the time wisely. Each of these profiles tends to benefit from different types of assistive technology, and assistive technology is absolutely the student's best friend. At some point in time, almost all of them need and will benefit from assistive technology, especially once they get into middle school. But the assistive technology can't be the same either, right? It has to be individualized based on the student's learning profiles, but also on what do they enjoy, how do they respond to these interventions and assistive technology. And last but not least, this is also important. Each profile may be associated with a variety of underlying causes. This is what makes doing this work so challenging. Dr. Wenzel mentioned English learners, Isabelina mentioned English learners. We have a preponderance of English learners, right, in our schools, and that's not going to change. In fact, it's going to continue to increase. What are the implications of that? Right? What are the implications? Because English learners, language is at the core. Students with dyslexia, language is at the core. Students with comprehension difficulties, language is at the core. What I take away from that is every teacher needs to be an expert in language. Every teacher has to have expertise in language. In the English language, at least, at the very least. And if they're expected to interface with students with, who are learning English as a second or third or whatever language, what are the implications for learning that language based on what their language is? Again, going back to the order of the day, which is to talk about students with dyslexia, typically we are talking about this specific word reading difficulty or profile. As I said before, we mentioned the other profiles exist, and when we're looking for these profiles, there are many other considerations that must be made, and I'm going to talk more about that. I shouldn't shortchange the last bullet, but I'm going to speak more about that, what the intervention should look like. So the National Early Literacy Panel really took the work of the National Reading Panel, which met in 2000 and released its famous report, and built on that, and then specifically looked at how reading could and should be taught in the early grades. And Tim Shanahan was the chair of that group, and he's talked extensively about the implications of the findings, which, the meta-analysis looked at over 7,000 studies and used 400 to 500 to give their final, suggestions for what the implications were. And really we're looking specifically at young children. And the reason I bring that up here is because we must think about early identification, right? We must think about how we can find these children early. So not to label, but to find them and give them the very best instruction so they don't go on to have a lot of other problems. The strong to moderate predictors are the usual suspects. Nothing here that you're surprised about, I'm sure. The last one, the rapid automatized naming, is usually not included in a universal screening. So that's something that I keep going back to. How are we going to find the students that have difficulty with retrieval, lexical access, that implicates and correlates so highly with fluency. So the critical reading skills for early identification, phonological awareness, accurate automatic letter naming, letter sound association, and not only word reading accuracy and fluency, but passage reading fluency. Because again, some of our students get really good at the word level. They have to practice in context. And that's really challenging and difficult because they don't like to read. And the only way that you get a student to improve reading is to get them to read. So it's a challenge for sure. So just to review our definition and the essential components, this early identification of phonological processing, and I'm working a lot in the last few years in the early grades, 3 to 5-year-olds. And as I said before, going into classrooms and I can sort of, find these children. We're not doing phonemic awareness with 3-year-olds. They are not able to segment words into phonemes at 3 years old. But we can find them because they struggle with rhyming, right? They struggle with sometimes articulation and repeating multisyllabic words. So we can see that there's something going on phonologically, right? And we have to figure out, again, with those young children, how to help them get to that alphabetic principle. And there's such great, fun, engaging, playful ways to do that with 4 and 5-year-olds. Wonderful ways to do that so that they understand how the English system works. I will go back to that too. So I want to talk now a little bit about the assessment, right? Because that's what I'm here to talk about, assessing and instructing these students. And everyone knows this, so this is just to contextualize this conversation. There are these 4 types of assessment. I like to relate it to a medical model because I think it's easy to get it when you think about what we do in medicine. We're going to specifically talk, or I'm going to specifically talk a little bit about the universal screening, the first alert, and a little bit about the progress monitoring and some about the diagnostic aspect of assessing students with 4 and with dyslexia. So this slide just reviews things that you already know about universal screening. It's why is the universal screening important here in Connecticut? Because we actually approved a list, a menu of reading assessments that went into effect, I think, full force last year. I think every district in the state of Connecticut had to have a universal screening in place. Many of you had them in place before, but not all, so that's terrific. And we can identify students who are at risk with these. Most of the screeners look at specific discrete skills associated with the things that I talked about earlier, the phonemic awareness, the letter recognition, etc. So this universal screening is the first step. But if we need to go a little step further to screen for dyslexia, we are going to want to think about these timed tests. Again, most of the screeners have timed tests for letter naming. Why is it important that it's timed? Because it's fluency driven, right? It's about being automatic with the skill. So in kindergarten and first grade, we want to know for sure that our children can name those letters automatically and that they know the letter sound associations automatically and that they're aware of phonemes and that they can do these phoneme awareness tasks beginning in kindergarten and through first grade. And that we're also looking in first grade at their ability to blend those sounds and segment those sounds for decoding and encoding. And then once they can do that, we want to start to see, can they put it all together by reading a passage fluently? So that oral reading fluency component. The CBMs, curriculum-based measures, which is what a universal screening is, right? It's a curriculum-based measure that's constructed to see if students are able to generalize these skills and what's been taught. but they don't tell us everything we need to know. So that's where diagnostic assessments come into play. The diagnostic assessments are so critically important because they will tell us why the students are in the red or the yellow zone if you use an assessment that has that kind of color coding, right? What specific skills has the student not mastered and needs to? And so in this case, we want to consider identification and a formal evaluation, okay? And a formal evaluation, which all of the school districts do, right? All of you are involved in evaluating students to see if they're eligible for services. And this requires and necessitates 4 aspects, right? The first is to look and see if you see indicators of neurobiological differences. And the best way to do that is to get a developmental history. Oftentimes you hear the parents tell you, I couldn't read. I didn't learn how to read. My uncle, my father, my brother, my, whatever it might be. So that's number 1. What's the history? And also, what's the child's history? So we want to look at the educational records. And again, in the interest of redundancy, if there have been assessments that have been done, you don't recreate and redo, right? You take what's been done and add to it. Classroom observation is incredibly important. So making sure that you see the student in his or her classroom with his or her peers. And if the student is in a RTI Tier 2, Tier 3, observing the student there as well. And then obviously the lion's share of the evaluation is the cognitive assessments and all the things that I just talked about. Don't forget comprehension and assessing comprehension, which I'll speak more about. In this slide, one of the books that you'll see at the end on the reference is an excellent book by Susan Lowell, Rebecca Felton, and Pam Hook. And it's specifically written, very short and sweet book that really describes in great detail the assessment of dyslexia, and they call it a component-based approach, which includes the things that I just mentioned. I will highlight a couple other things. Orthographic processing, right? So orthographic processing is assessing the student's ability to process print, right? So phonological processing is sound, orthographic is print. And so what the student with dyslexia struggles oftentimes with, first they have the phonological processing difficulties that we've been talking about, but then they have to associate the phonological information with the orthographic, right? And English is a very difficult language. It's one of the most difficult languages, right, in the world, in terms of its orthography, in terms of how we represent our sound system with letters. So again, teachers have to know this system cold. They have to know it inside and out to be able to translate it for their students. So that's something that should be included in this evaluation. How do they do processing the orthographic piece? And as you see it at the last 4 bullets, passage level comprehension, right? We still have to assess comprehension because even though we said earlier this profile has strengths in language comprehension, it may not translate to reading comprehension. In fact, it usually doesn't translate so well. Receptive vocabulary may also be an area that needs to be assessed because these students are not reading. So they're not building vocabulary. Their writing skills, that's another story for another day. 99% of these students struggle with writing. And last but not least, they could also have a math difficulty. So we have to look at all of these areas. I want to just take a minute because I think phonological processing, you've heard me say it at least 20 times now, so I want to take a couple minutes to talk about phonological processing. It's the neurological mechanism to process speech sounds, right? And to understand the oral sound and how it's represented. It includes 3 skills, right? So one, it includes phonological awareness, right, which I think is pretty well understood. But there's a second component that is equally important, and that is phonological memory, the ability to store these representations in memory. Remember, I started my talk by saying that there is comorbidity. This is where you're going to see comorbidity. This is where you're going to see things get messy and complicated. Because some of our students with dyslexia, straight phonemic awareness, that's it. Their memory's fine, their processing speed's fine. Those students are pretty, I don't want to say easy, but they're easier. If you have a student that has phonemic awareness issues and working memory, that's going to impact a whole lot of things, right? Including comprehension and math and all sorts of things. And then if you add the third component, right, rapid naming, now you have a real, I call it the triple whammy. So Marianne Wolf at Tufts has done a lot of research on the double deficit hypothesis. She developed RAVO in the laboratory to address students that have difficulty with speed, processing speed. But the triple whammy is if you have all three of those problems, and I'll come back to that. How do we assess phonological processing? So I just want, because you're all in the business of trying to find these students and figure out what their profiles are, I thought it might be good to take a minute to just explain this, because it is, somewhat complicated. Again, phonemic awareness, Robertson and Salter called the PAST. It's a great assessment, it's been around forever. It's nice because it looks at phonological awareness broadly and then at the micro level, right, at the phoneme level. CTOP2, again, a great assessment. I know most of you know, comprehensive test of phonological processing. You'll see it in all three categories. It's nice because you can give that assessment and you can really look at all three aspects of phonological processing. And then the Woodcock Reading Mastery Test also has a phonemic awareness subtest. For phonological memory, sentence recall and story recall, the WISC has a digit span and the CTOP has a digit span, and nonsense word repetition. Nonsense word repetition is so interesting because students with dyslexia have difficulty, remember, with that, it's the memory of having to say the word back. And if you give them a word like, I don't know, viduplia, or whatever one of the words is in CTOP, you can see how they really struggle with the sequencing of those syllables because it is processing and then a memory task. And then last but not least, the processing speed or naming speed. The RAN has been around for a long time, the Boston naming test, but also the CTOP has an assessment for that. So going back to our definition, our working definition, I want to talk specifically now about what does targeted, systematic, and explicit instruction look like, right? And provision of accommodations. Because without those, what happens is all areas of reading start to suffer. So now it's not just a decoding issue. Now it's the student has trouble with comprehension, the student has trouble with writing. We know this student has trouble with second language learning, right? And I often, with my own daughter, I advocated for her to learn Latin. And actually that was helpful because she didn't have to speak the language, but she started understanding about morphology and how morphology, there's lots of Latin-based words in English, and it really helped her vocabulary. And that took the place of learning Spanish or French or whatever, which would never have happened for her. And then the other one is the behavioral emotional reactions, and that's the most important of all, I think, is what happens to these students when they continue to fail and they continue to get frustrated and they are not getting, they're not feeling good about themselves. So they're acting out, or they're withdrawing, or they're becoming anxious or depressed, or whatever the case may be. So This is incredibly important, again, why I'm such a firm advocate of finding these students as early as possible. This, way back when, I started my work at Haskins Laboratories in 2000 as part of the early reading success legislation. And this is when I sort of took my special ed hat off and started going into general ed classrooms. And it was an amazing experience for me because I had spent my whole career in special education. And I started, my second year in teaching was in 1976 in Austin, Texas, when PL 94-142 came into place. So that was a game changer in special education. And after that, I spent 20 years in resource rooms, and then I had a private practice with students with dyslexia, et cetera. When I came back to Connecticut around this time in 2000 and started working in gen ed, it was so important for me to have that experience and also to work with teachers at the very first pass. If we don't get tier 1 right, forget about it. We have to get tier 1 right, because otherwise we're going to have the upside down triangle, which we see in our schools, our high poverty schools, the upside down triangle, where most of those children getting tier 2 and 3 support are curriculum casualties. So the experience I've had for the last 16 years in gen ed has been irreplaceable. When we started on this journey, we said, okay, we want teachers to know about the National Reading Panel, and so we came up with this wheel. And just looking at the wheel, you can see the 5 big ideas, but we added a couple. We added spelling into the phonics section. We added written expression into the text comprehension section. And then you'll see some changes in a minute that went beyond that. I show you that because we always want to go back to reading is multifaceted. There's many pieces to this puzzle. And so in the middle section, you see those 5 big ideas. In the left, you see assessments that are associated with each of those 5 ideas. And this is just an example, so you can see that we're always talking to our teachers about linking your assessment data to the reading interventions that's required. So one size doesn't do the trick. So for phonemic awareness, Say It and Move It, which is part of Darlene Tangle and Benita Blackman's Road to the Code. Wilson, excellent intervention for students that need decoding and encoding. Read Naturally, an intervention for students who have fluency difficulties, text talk, vocabulary, questioning the author, comprehension. So you can see that as administrators and teachers, you need to have an arsenal of tools, and you need to strategically think about which tool works for which students and why. I told you that I would have to, we can never be satisfied with status quo, so we recently, a couple of years ago, switched the things up a little bit in the reading wheel, and we took fluency out because what we saw in the field was teachers getting kids to try to read fast. And that really penalizes our students with dyslexia, especially if they have processing speed difficulties. Okay, so we replaced it with syntax. And this is one of my favorite quotes for Marianne Wolf. I'm going to go a little faster because I got the signal. I have 10 minutes left. What I want to say here is that, and you've heard me say it, but it's worth saying again, dyslexia and reading disabilities, it's complicated. There's a continuum of severity that requires a continuum of instruction that requires increasing amounts of teacher knowledge and expertise. So just something to think about. As I said before, the treatment is educational. And this is a quote, I don't know who this person is. I want to meet him or her someday. I've tried to track the reference down, but I love the reference because what it says to me is that not only do our students who struggle have a hard time because of their learning challenges, but as teachers, we have to work extra hard. I used to get so upset when teachers would come into my classroom when I was a resource teacher and they go, "You have got it made in the shade. 5 kids, wow. Wow, I wish I only had 5 kids in my classroom." And you know, and you all know, and you're laughing because you know what I'm talking about. Well, I had 32 kids on my caseload in that first year of teaching. So, you know, yes, maybe at one time I only had 3 or 4 or 5 students in my classroom, but it certainly wasn't the whole picture. Here are some successful intervention elements. I will not read them. As you notice, I didn't read any of my slides for the most part. But this really is why I think this is important to show you, is because there's research behind these elements. You hear these words all the time. There's actually phenomenal research study conducted by these individuals that showed these techniques actually work. I have to acknowledge here, I said I would talk just briefly about progress monitoring and the data analysis. Why is it so important? Because in those LD guidelines I referenced before, on page 49 to be exact, we talk about the dual discrepancy. So it's not just about, you know, where the levels where students start, right, being behind, but are you doing what's necessary to catch them up, to close the gap? A lot of what I've learned over the years in terms of dyslexia, 2 things. One is, obviously, there's no substitute for being in the field and being with the students. The other is being part of a professional network of wonderful individuals. The International Dyslexia Association, which I've been a member of since 1976, is that group, and they've done amazing work. The people that are part of that organization are phenomenal individuals, and a couple years ago they decided that to unite the disparate groups that are part of that organization, including Wilson, Slingerland, Project Read, Orton Gillingham, Alphabetic Phonics, just to name a few, that we thought it would be wonderful to advance our work if we could all agree on one term. And that one term landed on structured literacy. There are 2 components. You can find a handout. It's a 2-page handout. I recommend that you take a good look at it, and in some cases it may be appropriate to use that in the work that you do. There are the elements of language, and there are the principles of instruction. These are the elements. What I want to say about this is, again, this is language. If you're a speech and language pathologist, any SLPs in the room? 1, maybe more. Anyway, this is what you learn, right? This is what you learn. It's language. Language is reading. Reading is language, right? English is morphophonemic. What does that mean? It's not just based on sounds, it's based on meaning. So morphology is a very important part of the puzzle. These are the principles of instruction. You all know these. You hear them all the time. Okay, so, but I'm calling them out because they're so very, very important. One other concept I think is important to talk about, right? Because of RTI, SRBI, we have a choice. When we look for the interventions for the students, right, we have a choice. We can choose a problem-solving approach or a standard treatment protocol. This is from the IRIS Center at Peabody Vanderbilt. I know it's hard to read the slide, but it's a nice little comparison. A standard treatment protocol is a single intervention like a Wilson, right? Interventionists, if they're going to deliver that, they must do it with fidelity and with proper training and ongoing support. Okay, versus a problem-solving approach, right? Where you as a team get together and decide there isn't a standard treatment that works for this student, and we're going to go with a problem-solving approach instead, right? And in this case, the teacher needs to be really, really well trained because they have to make decisions every minute about which direction to go, right? A standard treatment is usually much more cut and dry, black and white, concrete, whatever you want to call it. Tim Odegaard, somebody I've worked with or talked to at least at Middle Tennessee State University, came up with this, this chart, which I thought is nice to illustrate, again, the complexity of delivering an intervention. And this is just an example for word reading. What are you going to be wanting to work on? If the student has spelling, which they often do, spelling difficulties, these are the things that you would need to be paying attention to. And on the right-hand side, comprehension, a totally different intervention is needed for those students. Whatever it is, whatever the profile, whatever the intervention you decide on, you do it through a team approach. It's not a unilateral decision made by one or two people. It's made with a team. And I'm preaching to the choir, but I have to say this, it's so very important. Isabelina talked a lot about the parent engagement, which was the focus last year of your back to school meeting. And I've been doing a lot of parent engagement work for the last 3 years with Elaine Zimmerman, who's taught me so much about engaging families and parents. And so this is a team approach, right? And it requires a lot more work. It's so much easier to make a decision by yourself. It's a whole lot harder when you have to include everybody, when you have to acknowledge everybody's opinion and expertise and whatnot, right? But it's so incredibly important. Again, I can't go through all the bullets at the bottom in detail, but take a look and read those, because that's important. Couple more things. I talked about social emotional consequences, and I just had to include this because it's relevant for so many of our students. And I lived it with my daughter. It's incredibly difficult and challenging, but we have to acknowledge that social emotional component. We also have to acknowledge, and this is very hard for teachers, because you're doing the intervention, but we're saying, oh, but don't forget, students with dyslexia have talents and gifts, and they're good at lots of things. Somehow that has to come into the picture. Somehow, even if it's just a conversation with the child before you sit down to do the hard work. I heard you had a soccer game over the weekend. How did it go? How many goals did you score? I heard you're the winning, star. Whatever that child's strengths are, you have to try to figure out how to acknowledge those. These are just some of the things that I've highlighted: the ability to solve problems. These students really, with dyslexia, have incredible resilience. What we find about them is that they have somebody who's plugging for them. It's usually a parent, almost always mom. But if it isn't mom or dad, if you can be that person's advocate, if one of you, knowing that that child doesn't have somebody at home going to bat for him or her, please think about how you could be that child's advocate. I'll leave you just with a quick summary. We talked about early identification. We talked about explicit instruction designed to meet the needs of these students, progress monitoring, comprehensive programming, and last but not least, helping the student become an advocate for him or herself while supporting the family. Thank you so very, very much.